Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and I do hope that you're doing exceedingly well and that you're going to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa because you're going to need it, because we've got a fabulous story for you tonight. So before you settle down, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Oliver and I'm from the Pacific Northwest in Northern America. And my illustrious Bigfoot encounter happened in 1984 when I was 12 years old at the time, and is an account that is so treasured by me that it has never ever been forgotten. For indeed it is as fresh in my mind as if it transpired yesterday. Other events, of course, have not got the same memorable effect on me. Without a shadow of a doubt, meeting the hairy critter that we love to call Bigfoot left an indelible, arresting impression on my mind that I shall never forget as long as I shall live. At the time, I could not comprehend what on earth it was that I encountered, because in those days, no one had ever heard of a hairy humanoid before. I grew up in a rural neighbourhood with my mother and father and my sister Dawn, who was 1 year younger than I was at the time. All the attractive-looking houses in our area were built relatively close together, with sizable front and back yards. Our quaint little country street was situated on a white gravel road, which had not been tarmacked in those days. All the houses were very individualistic, with all their own character and personality, some with leanings towards more historic architecture, while others were much more contemporary in design. One thing that all the houses had in common was that they were painted in bright, cheerful Moroccan colours that really lifted your spirits, with pristinely manicured lawns and very pretty yards that were always planted up with seasonal colourful flowers in spring and summer. Our house was no exception to the rule and was your quintessential ranch-style home that was painted in a rustic peach colour with a generous fenced-in backyard, a large entertainment area and a very sizable swimming pool. I grew up in an area with exquisite panoramic views of statuesque imposing mountains and vast areas of dreamy forest. In our part of the world we had prairies, silvery lakes, rugged outcrops and sumptuous green valleys, fields of crops, pretty barns and meadows with galloping horses or grazing cows, so I really did live in the heart of the countryside, and the natural world was my illustrious acclaimed playground. If you drove to the end of our road, you reached a fork that led to two gravel roads, and the road on the right-hand side led to a rocky embankment that towered up to an exquisite broad expanse of ubiquitous natural forest that was built up on high mountainous ridge, with a beautiful stream that zigzagged throughout the rugged valley and jutted out into rocky alcoves, forming enchanting little rock pools and cascading waterfalls with streams of water that jetted powerfully through the rocks in luscious showers of crystal white foam. It was fortunate that the hilly elevations of this sumptuous forest were made easier for visitors frequenting these woods, as the Forestry Commission had cleared the steep elevated pathways and secured some sturdy poled fencing to offer structural support against some of the rocky outcrops in order to ensure safety for hikers, walkers and cyclists. This rugged elevated woodland was dotted with many masterful pieces of rock, dense green ground covers such as ferns and various ivies, and trees that towered into the sky, crowned with glorious heads of resplendent green foliage. If that wasn't enough eye candy for you, the forest was like a lighthouse beacon for all the indigenous wildlife that frequented the woods for cover, especially during the heat of the day, to quench their thirst by enjoying a refreshing drink by the stream. It was not uncommon to see deer at the water's edge frolicking in the splendicious shaded retreat. Then there were squirrels that darted from tree to tree like furry gymnasts, and songbirds that would serenade you with their joyful renditions of tweets and warbles. These woods were frequented not only by the kids in the area, but local dog walkers or hikers taking a little morning stroll to sharpen their brains, enhance their physical fitness, and elevate their moods. Growing up, I would spend my days playing with the kids in the street, and we would ride our bicycles freely all over the local area, and we would take the gravel road to the left if we had a hankering for some candies. This gravel road ultimately led to some small quaint shops in the town, including the very best sweet shop ever, where we would buy several ounces of our favourite candies that were presented to us in a white paper bag. In those days, 150 ounces of candy would cost exactly 26 cents. How much times has changed since then, because nowadays we cannot buy anything for that price. When we took the gravel road to the right, it would lead to the dreamy emerald forest, where we would hang out by the stream, throwing pebbles in the water, catching frogs or making white paper boats that we would invariably float on the water. We would play hide and seek, kick the can, hopscotch, and even jump rope in the woods. We would swim in the rock pools and even eat our lunches on a smooth rocky outcrop that we called the King's Throne. You see, in those days our parents could afford to be much more easygoing, carefree and somewhat lackadaisical as to our whereabouts, because crime was pretty much non-existent in our neck of the woods in those bygone days. Living in a small town meant that all the locals were very well acquainted with each other, and most people were congenial, companionable and friendly, with the exception of the peevish Mr. Bird, who lived in the mediocre, rather grim-looking box-shaped house next door to ours. The only way that I can describe the crusty codger was that he was a cantankerous, cranky old man that never wore a smile a day in his life, and was exceedingly disagreeable, crabby, and almost always rude. The greatest irony of all was that he was married to the kindest, sweetest, most mellow and chilled-out woman in the street, who was a portly woman with a jovial smile, charming disposition, and a great sense of humour. It would seem that they were the most unlikely couple. It was rather like a well-rounded Mary Poppins being married to the Grim Reaper, and people in our neighbourhood would often pontificate about how this unlikely couple ever came into being. "What does she see in him?" they would say. It was really like sweet and sour merging together in a marital union. But as one lady eloquently put it to my mother, sweet and sour Chinese pork works great in a combination in food. Perhaps it also works the same in human relationships. The vinegary Mr. Bird was blatantly rude and was not afraid to express his opinion, regardless of the offence he caused. Politeness was definitely not one of his virtues, nor one of his graces. That's if he had any, of course, which was highly unlikely. Mr. and Mrs. Bird ran the local dry cleaners in our town, and everybody always hoped that they would be dealing with Mrs. Bird when it came to any business transactions. One day my mother went to the dry cleaners and was almost met with a barrage of abuse from Mr. Bird, who told her that her kids, referring to my sister and I, of course, were a good reflection of her appalling bad parenting skills. "They're always littering the stream with their dreadful paper boats," he complained, "and leaving the crusts behind from their sandwiches on the ground, littering the pristine forest in a deplorable way," he chastised. "You should be ashamed of yourself, allowing your children to pollute the environment like that." "But, Mr. Bird," protested my mother, "the paper boats are biodegradable, and as for the sandwich crusts, the children leave them behind for the birds or raccoons to eat, so that's hardly littering, is it?" "More like encouraging vermin in the forest," protested Mr. Bird vehemently. "I'd like to remind you that the people around here would like to visit a pristine, clean forest, not a woodland running rampant with rats. You need to instill some manners in those kids of yours. Do you know how much damage they've done to my front yard with those bicycles of theirs, trailing their muddy wheels into my grass, removing the turf? As for that dreadful bulldog of yours, why on earth is she always lifting her leg on my garden shrubs in particular? I notice it's always my yard she chooses to mark, and nobody else's in the street. If I didn't know any better, I would say your kids were deliberately getting her to pee there, just to get my back up." "Oh, I'm sure that's not the case, Mr. Bird," my mother assured him. "My kids would never be so disrespectful to your garden turf, nor to your shrubs." "Well, tell those rambunctious, good-for-nothing kids of yours that I'm watching them very closely, including that flat-snouted bulldog of yours. I'm watching her too." If you think Mr. Bird was rude to my mother, do not let me get started. There was barely a person in our town that had not experienced the wrath of Mr. Bird at some point. He even told the pastor at our local church that his sermon was absolute hogwash when he talked about the value of giving over receiving in one of his sermons. "Everybody knows that's not true," Mr. Bird chided. "Do you think it would give me more pleasure to give $1 million away, or to keep it for myself?" he said to the pastor. "Well, you would feel good if you made a difference to someone else's life with such a generous donation," said the pastor. "If you were fortunate enough, of course, to have such a sizable amount of accessible funds to give away. It feels good to help others, and is pleasing to God, who blesses those who give generously." "What utter balderdash!" sniggered Mr. Bird. "I'd keep the money to improve my lot. What joy is it going to give me to make somebody else rich at my expense? If you ask me, the church is manipulating people to give their cash, but you'll not be getting a penny from me." "I'm sorry to hear that," said the pastor. "Lucky for you," said Mr. Bird. "Your fleeceable congregation is gullible enough to fall for your sermons. But not me. I know exactly what's going on. And I'm no fool," he said, tapping his nose. Another time Mr. Bird told the host at a neighbour's dinner party that her food was bland, insipid and exceedingly dreary. "You really haven't got the first clue how to cook, have you?" he told her. "Every chef will tell you that seasoning is imperative. I cannot possibly eat such flavourless food," he said, pushing the plate away with a look of absolute disgust on his face. "And as for this chicken, it's as tough as a dried-up old boot." Meanwhile, his wife was apologising profusely for her husband's atrocious manners. All the while, her husband left the table only to return with a takeaway from the local kebab shop that he ate at the dinner party in front of the stunned, rather appalled and shocked guests, who were secretly green at the gills with envy. My mother told me that the food was so awful she could see that all the guests were drooling like a dog over a bone as the smells of Mr. Bird's delicious food wafted over to them. They all kept looking at him as he ate his food and tucked into the tender, juicy pieces of marinated chicken, pita bread and long, crisp potato chips, while they were stuck eating something that was told was steak but looked much more like the sole of a leather shoe and was so tough it was barely edible. "Is my food really that terrible?" asked the host. "Of course not," the guests assured her, doing their level best to swallow the food on their plate. "It's absolutely delicious," they lied. My mother said that after that dinner party, she rushed to the kebab shop as quickly as she could, because after smelling Mr. Bird's delicious kebab, she was unable to resist buying one for herself. My strange story begins when my sister and I were making some paper boats to float down the stream, when Mr. Bird tottered up to us with a belligerent look on his face. "I see you're at it again," he smirked, "polluting the stream with your paper boats. You are both litterbugs, and I think the word bug is most befitting when it comes to the two of you, crawling around the place like a constant irritant that needs to be swatted." My sister and I said nothing as Mr. Bird rambled on about the woes of littering a forest. Guiltily, we both ran down towards the water's edge to grab our paper boats, to appease Mr. Bird. Suddenly we heard Mr. Bird screaming, "No! No!" and we raced back from the small hilly incline that surrounded the stream, and that was when we saw the biggest monster that you've ever seen, and to our amazement this colossal creature had literally flung Mr. Bird over his monstrously large shoulders and was walking away with him while Mr. Bird was shrieking, "Help! Help! Help!" In those few seconds that all this transpired, my sister and I got a good look at this titanic creature. I remember thinking that he was easily as tall and as wide as our front door, so that would make him about 9 foot tall. He was very heavy, burly, muscular, stockily built, and covered in long flowing brown hair. He looked like a cross between an ape and a man, and I remember his very long arms fell below his knees. The head of this creature was shaped like a cone, which flowed into the most Herculean-sized shoulders that I've ever seen in my entire life. I noticed the creature had no neck to speak of. I only briefly got to see the face that looked so human-like it was almost uncanny. The strange thing about the critter was it was taking no notice of Mr. Bird's caterwauling and was holding his arms down on one side of his shoulder and his scrawly legs on the other side, so that Mr. Bird was pinned down to the creature by his huge, humongous hands, which meant that he could not fight back. The critter glided away happily, whistling a pretty tune to himself as he carried the rambunctious, belligerent and protesting bundle of Mr. Bird away, while taking these massive strides with his powerful legs. "Oh my goodness," gasped my sister, "he's going to eat Mr. Bird." My sister and I rushed back home to tell my mother that a monster in the woods had actually eaten Mr. Bird. My mother scolded us and told us to stop making such terrible stories up. I know he's not a nice man, but you don't have to stoop to his level by making up such outrageous stories. Frankly, I'm disappointed in you both for being so mean about Mr. Bird. Maybe Mr. Bird was right, and you should learn to mind your manners. No, but it's true, Mum. A really big, horrible beast stole Mr. Bird. Go to your room at once, ordered my mother. Now. It was no use talking to my mother, but I assured my sister that before long Mr. Bird would be reported as missing, and then the adults would finally believe our story. Imagine our amazement when we discovered Mr. Bird in his front yard the following morning, planting some seedlings in the soil and humming away happily to himself. "Are you all right, Mr. Bird?" I asked. "How did you get away from the monster?" "What monster?" asked Mr. Bird. "What are you talking about, boy?" My sister and I looked at each other in absolute awe. Why could Mr. Bird not remember being snatched up by a big monster that we had seen? And why was he pretending that no such thing had happened to him? And stranger still, why had the monster not eaten him? If that was not peculiar enough, Mr. Bird had a personality transformation, much like someone might have a kidney or liver transplant, because it was that radical and extreme. And all of this happened after he'd been abducted by the mysterious giant-like creature. I'm not exaggerating when I say that, because he became very charming, complimentary, and exceedingly nice. He even handed money over at church for collections one Sunday, and the pastor was so shocked by the spontaneous display of generosity that he almost passed out. I would describe Mr. Bird's transformation as uncannily similar to Scrooge in the Christmas Carol. He suddenly became a very generous, kind-hearted man. Everyone could not understand what on earth had happened to him, especially his own wife, who was warming to her more amenable, loving husband. I believe he knocked his head very hard, she told us. He did lose his immediate memory because when he returned from his walk, much later than usual from the woods, he seemed rather confused, muddled and disorientated for a while. He didn't even know who or where he was for a moment, which was odd because he managed to make his way back to the house. He kept complaining that his head was thumping so much. I believe he did have a nasty fall, still no harm done, because he's right as rain now and has changed completely, but I'm not complaining. Henceforth, some people believe Mr. Bird had sustained a very nasty blow to his head that had activated another part of his brain, which actually can change your personality quite remarkably. It would seem even his interests had changed, and he sold up the old dry cleaners and opened up an ice cream parlour next to the baker's. When my sister and I would go into the parlour, he always gave us free ice creams because we were his neighbours, so we received special treatment. At one time we were bugs that needed to be swatted, and now we were his favourite kids in the street. His passion for ice cream was utterly extraordinary. He even went to Italy for lessons in gelato making and invested in the most cutting-edge ice cream machines, which he brought all the way back to North America. And it wasn't long before people flocked from far and wide to taste his outstanding gelato, and some of them were made from his own secretly inspired recipes. He made the most delicious cinnamon bun, licorice, apple crumble, chocolate chip and rocky road, and to date they were without question the best ice creams I've ever tasted. There was only one problem, that his wife, the charming Mrs. Bird, had a very sweet tooth, and her excessive overindulgence in the delicious ice cream meant she just grew and grew until she became incredibly huge. I remember thinking she looked so buoyant, rather like an inflated beach ball or a beached whale, which made her seem sweeter than ever in my opinion. Many years after this extraordinary event, my sister and I would ask ourselves over and over again, what actually happened to Mr. Bird? I can only surmise that the critter, which we now know in hindsight was actually a Bigfoot, meant him no harm. Unless, of course, Mr. Bird managed to dodge the Bigfoot and in an attempt to run away, hit his head, but I think still that that is less likely. In some way, I believe he accidentally hit his head very hard, which activated the more sensitive side of his brain. I reached this opinion after a lady in our town fell off her horse, hitting her head very badly, which caused her to lose her sense of taste and smell permanently. Before her accident, she was a very flamboyant woman who was an incredible opera singer with a magnificent voice that could hit the highest notes. Now this very same woman is painfully shy and reticent, loves to sew and embroider, and goes hiking regularly, yet she cannot sing a single tuneful note. It would seem that her personality, skills, talents and interests completely changed, much like Mr. Bird's did. So something happened to Mr. Bird that fateful day when he was abducted by the hairy critter. But what really transpired, we cannot fathom or even imagine. But it certainly transformed him from a big bully to a very likeable person indeed. Mr. Bird tragically died about 20 years ago, 2 years after his wife's death. Believe it or not, he left me his ice cream parlour in his will, as he discovered I had a fervent passion for ice cream and wanted the business to continue long after he'd gone. But he wanted to pass it to someone with a similar passion for the craft. So that's why he left it to me, much to my astonishment. I'm still selling ice creams to this day from the original shop that Mr. Bird once opened all those years ago. And it is indeed a thriving business. And like Mr. Bird, I'm passionate about ice creams and creating new and ingenious and inspirational recipes. So there you are. That's my story. I just want to thank you so very much for that story. Very, very fascinating indeed. So until next time, goodbye and good night.